Principle 3. You go faster alone, but you can go further together. It was on Monday, the 19th of July, 2010, that the Big Society Network was launched, with a fanfare of a speech from the then Prime Minister, David Cameron. He said it was a national campaign for social change, run by the people, for the people. But 4 years later, the Big Society Network collapsed. On the 24th of April, 2015, its founding CEO, Paul Twivy, who'd resigned after just a year in the post, was interviewed on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme. He was asked by the presenter, why didn't it work? His answer was this. It was a series of broken promises, he said, explaining that in his view, the UK had one of the most centralised governments in the developed world, and that needed to change. He concluded that we need a government that's going to appeal to us as human beings, not just as units of GDP. Those things aren't happening, he said, so we need reform. Successful big societies, of course, are made up of lots of small communities. What we call the National Health Service would be better labelled the National Sickness Service. The point at which any of us engages with it is when we are ill, a sickness service. When do you make an appointment with the GP? When do you go to the hospital or see a specialist? When you're sick, when you're ill, when you've got a health emergency. So what we need most, therefore, is a second service to help people stay healthy in the first place, to fulfil a complementary role alongside our existing NHS. And that service must be holistic and it must be local. Our problem is that we've over-medicalised healthcare. We've focused our thinking and all of our energy and funding far, far too narrowly. It's time, therefore, to think differently and to invest in the other pillars on which real health and well-being are built. Health is three-dimensional. It's about body, mind and spirit. That's why the NHS alone, on its own, just can't solve the health problems of the UK. It's time to think more radically. I remember a conversation in Downing Street, number 10 Downing Street, with Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time. This was almost 20 years ago. The conversation was about the stress on the NHS. So this conversation we're having now isn't a new one. Using the metaphor together of being responsible for the baby, I explained that before the NHS was set up, the churches, faith groups, the trade unions, voluntary groups, they carried the baby alone. But then with the invention of the NHS, Tony butted in and said, we snatched the baby. Government took full responsibility for the baby. But the problem is that neither of us could do the job on our own. We need each other. This child, the NHS, needed two parents. I explained to him that the impact of replacing the work of voluntary bodies with that of a vast team of government-paid workers in the NHS also came with another unforeseen outcome. It left charities, it left churches feeling sidelined and redundant. It robbed them of their raison d'etre, their reason for being. At the height of the COVID pandemic in June 2020, Boris Johnson commissioned Danny Kruger, one of his Conservative MPs, to draw up a set of proposals around how to sustain the community spirit that we'd seen in those first months of the crisis. In response, Kruger outlined what he decided to term a new social covenant as a way in which civil society, charities, individuals could contribute to the Prime Minister's levelling up agenda and so strengthen families and our local communities. He claimed, we need a new social and economic model to achieve all this, a wholly new paradigm, as he put it, in which he claimed community power needed to replace the dominance of remote public and private sector bureaucracy. It's time to invest in doing the big society the small community way, because, as we all know, you can go faster alone, but you can go further together.